Caroline Kennedy was born into a name that sounded almost magical. Kennedy, a name that carried power, a name that carried beauty, a name that carried money, history, ambition, and danger. To the outside world, that name looked like a crown. It opened doors, it filled rooms, it made strangers turn their heads. It connected a child to presidents, senators, ambassadors, war heroes, public servants, socialites, millionaires, and legends. Caroline seemed to inherit everything most people dream of. A famous father, a graceful mother, a childhood inside the White House, a life surrounded by privilege, a future already touched by history. She had the name, she had the beauty, she had the public admiration. She had the kind of family story that Americans wanted to believe in. But there was another inheritance waiting for her, one that no child should ever receive. Loss, fear, silence, public mourning, private loneliness, and the impossible weight of surviving when so many others did not. Caroline Kennedy did not simply grow up famous. She grew up watched. She grew up remembered. She grew up inside a national wound. Millions of people saw her before she understood what they were seeing. They saw the little girl in the White House, the daughter of a young president, the child standing beside a grieving mother, the last daughter of a dream America called Camelot. But Caroline's real life was not a fairy tale. It was not only about privilege. It was not only about power. It was not only about the glow of a famous family. It was about what happens when the world turns your childhood into a symbol. It was about what happens when every personal tragedy becomes public memory. It was about a woman trying to build a private life, while history kept pulling her back into the light. She would become an author, a lawyer, a mother, a diplomat, a guardian of one of America's most powerful family legacies. But behind every title was a deeper question. How do you become yourself when the world keeps asking you to remain someone else's daughter? How do you live freely when your name belongs partly to strangers? How do you grieve when the whole country thinks it has the right to grieve with you? And how do you survive a family legend that gave you everything visible but could not give you peace? This is the hidden tragedy of Caroline Kennedy, the woman who inherited Camelot and spent a lifetime learning that even the most golden names can cast the darkest shadows. Before Caroline Kennedy became an ambassador, before she became a public figure in her own right, before she became the last surviving child of President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, she was first a child in a photograph, a little girl with a neat haircut, a quiet face, a careful smile, a child who seemed to belong to a perfect American picture. The world saw innocence, it saw charm, it saw the daughter of youth and power, it saw a family that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. And in a way, that was the beginning of the problem. Because the more perfect the image looked, the more impossible the real life became. The Kennedy White House was not just a political center. It became a stage. Every room carried importance, every dinner had meaning, every photograph looked like history. And Caroline was placed inside that history before she could understand it. She did not choose to become a symbol of American hope. She did not choose to become part of a national myth. She was simply born into a family the public wanted to love. In the early 1960s, Americans were fascinated by the Kennedys. John F. Kennedy was young, handsome, and energetic. Jacqueline Kennedy was elegant, cultured, and mysterious. Their children made the presidency feel warm, human, and almost intimate. For many people, Caroline and her brother John Jr. turned the White House from a distant seat of power into something softer. A home, a family, a place where children played while history unfolded nearby. Photographs of Caroline riding her pony, walking with her mother, standing near her father, or playing on the White House grounds became part of the public imagination. The public did not see a child under pressure. It saw a little princess of American democracy. But children do not live as symbols. They live in small moments, in mourning, in toys, in voices they trust, in the safety of familiar arms. A child does not understand that a camera can turn her into a memory. A child does not understand that strangers can love her for reasons she never asked for. Caroline's childhood was filled with privilege, but it was also surrounded by invisible walls. There were Secret Service agents. There were photographers. There were reporters. There were adults who spoke carefully because they knew the family belonged to history. Even inside the White House, Jacqueline Kennedy tried to give her children something close to normal life. She protected them from excessive attention. She created routines. She arranged schooling. She guarded their privacy with the instinct of a mother who understood danger long before the public did. But privacy inside the White House was always fragile. The world wanted to see the Kennedy children, not cruelly, not always aggressively, but constantly, and constant attention can become its own kind of loneliness. Caroline Booty was born on November 27, 1957, in New York City. Her father, John F. Kennedy, was then a senator from Massachusetts. Her mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, came from a world of social polish, education, taste, and discipline. The Kennedys were already powerful. The Bouvier had elegance and status. Caroline was born at the intersection of ambition and refinement. But her birth also came after heartbreak. Jacqueline had suffered pregnancy loss before Caroline arrived. A daughter, Arabella, had been stillborn in 1956, so Caroline's arrival brought something more than ordinary joy. She represented recovery. She represented hope. She represented the possibility that after sorrow, life could still continue. For the first few years of her life, Caroline lived in Georgetown, where her father's political career was rising quickly. The family home was filled with movement, meetings, visitors, phone calls, political planning, the atmosphere of a family preparing for something enormous. The Kennedys did not move through the world quietly. They moved with purpose. They believed in winning. They believed in service. They believed in legacy. And legacy, in that family, was never a passive word. It was something expected, something inherited, something demanded. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. Caroline was almost 3 years old. Most children at that age are learning the boundaries of their small world. Home, family, school, favorite toys, familiar rooms. Caroline's world suddenly expanded into the most famous address in America, the White House. On January 20, 1961, her father became president. The Kennedy family moved into a building that belonged not only to them, but to the country. From that moment, Caroline's childhood became part private life, part public story. She had a bedroom. She had lessons. She had playtime. She had a mother trying to protect her. But she also had photographers waiting, reporters watching, a nation curious about her smallest gestures. To the public, this looked charming. A young president with young children. A first lady bringing beauty and art into American power. A little girl who seemed to soften the hard edges of politics. But beneath that charm was an emotional truth Caroline would understand more deeply with time. When a family becomes a myth, the children inside it lose something ordinary and precious. They lose the right to belong only to themselves. Caroline's early years in the White House seemed golden. But gold can be heavy. It shines, it attracts attention, it impresses strangers, but it does not protect the heart. Then came the first deep wound. In August 1963, Jacqueline Kennedy gave birth to a son, Patrick. For a moment, the family had new joy, a new baby, a new beginning. A sense that after Earl's laces, life had answered with another chance. But Patrick was born prematurely. He lived only 2 days. The President and First Lady were devastated. For Caroline, still only a small child, the meaning of death was difficult to understand. But children feel sorrow even when they cannot explain it. They sense when the air changes. They know when adults speak more softly. They feel when a house becomes heavy. The White House, so often photographed as a place of youth and promise, had already become a place of grief. And only 3 months later, grief would become the defining event of Caroline Kennedy's life. November 22, 1963, began like an ordinary day. Caroline was 5 years old. Her father was in Dallas, Texas. She was in Washington. There was no reason for her to understand that history was moving toward her. No reason to know that before the day ended, her childhood would be divided forever into before and after. In Dallas, President Kennedy rode through the city in an open motorcade. Crowds gathered along the streets. People waved. The president smiled. Jacqueline sat beside him, then shots rang out. The images from that day would be replayed for generations. But for Caroline, the event was not history first. It was absence. Her father did not come home. That is the simplest and most devastating truth. The man the world called president was the man she called daddy. And suddenly he was gone. It is impossible to fully know what a 5-year-old understands in such a moment. Death is too large. Assassination is too cruel. Public mourning is too strange. Adults had to find words for something that barely had words. How do you tell a child that her father has been killed? How do you explain that the safest people are not always safe? How do you explain that power cannot stop violence? The days that followed became part of American memory. The funeral, the black veil, the flag, the silent crowds, the small children. Caroline stood near her mother. Her brother John Jr. saluted his father's coffin. The nation wept. Millions of people watched those images and felt that they were witnessing the end of innocence. But Caroline was not performing grief for the country. She was living it. The public saw a brave little girl, a dignified daughter, a symbol of national heartbreak. But as that symbol was a child trying to understand why the center of her world had vanished. From that day forward, Caroline Kennedy would never simply be Caroline. She would be the daughter of the slain president, the child of Camelot, the living reminder of what America had lost. And that kind of identity follows a person everywhere. It enters rooms before they do. It shapes how people speak to them. It turns ordinary growth into public observation. The dead remain fixed in memory, but the children of the dead must keep changing. Caroline had to grow up while strangers kept remembering her as a child at a funeral. After the assassination, Jacqueline Kennedy made the painful decision to leave the White House. The building had been their home, but it was also the place where the public memory of the Kennedy presidency would be preserved. For Jacqueline and her children, staying there was impossible. They needed protection. They needed distance. They needed somewhere grief could breathe. They first returned to Georgetown. But even there, privacy did not return. People gathered outside. Tourists passed by. Cameras waited. The family's sorrow had become part of the public landscape. Jacqueline soon moved Caroline and John Jr. to New York City. New York offered anonymity, or at least the possibility of it. A larger city. A faster city. A place where famous people could sometimes disappear into the crowd. But Caroline could never fully disappear. The Kennedy name made sure of that. She attended school in Manhattan. She studied. She formed friendships. She tried to become a normal girl. But normal life was always interrupted by recognition, by protection, by memory, by the knowledge that classmates, parents, teachers, and strangers already knew the most painful chapter of her childhood. Some public accounts have described Caroline as shy and private in her youth. That privacy may not have been simply temperament, it may have been a survival skill. A child who has been watched too closely learns to protect the parts of herself that no one can photograph. Silence becomes shelter. Distance becomes control. Privacy becomes a form of dignity. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis understood this better than anyone. She had been turned into an icon by grief. She had been admired for her composure, analyzed for her clothes, judged for her choices, possessed by the public imagination, and she did not want her children destroyed by the same attention. She wanted Caroline to be educated, cultured, strong, independent. She wanted her daughter to know history, literature, language, and art. She wanted Caroline to become someone, not merely represent someone. But history was never finished with the Kennedys, and soon another man Caroline loved would be taken. Robert F. Kennedy, her uncle Bobby, became an important presence after her father's death. He was not a replacement. No one could replace John F. Kennedy. But he was warmth, he was family, he was continuity. He was a voice from the same world as her father. For Caroline and John Jr., Bobby helped keep part of their father's presence alive. He spent time with them. He understood the family's wounds. He carried his own grief too. By 1968, Robert Kennedy was running for president. The country, still wounded by the assassination of John Kennedy, saw in Bobby another possibility. A return, a continuation, a second chance. But hope in Caroline's life had already become dangerous. On June 5, 1968, Robert Kennedy won the California Democratic primary. Later that night, he was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the next day. Caroline was 10 years old. At 5, she had lost her father to an assassin. At 10, she lost the uncle who had helped steady the family after that loss. The pattern was too painful to ignore. The Kennedy family, admired by millions, seemed unable to escape violence. For Jacqueline, Bobby's death deepened her fear. She had already seen what political life could cost. Now she had seen it again. Her children were Kennedys. And in her mind, that name no longer meant only admiration. It meant danger. In October 1968, Jacqueline married Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate. The marriage shocked many Americans. Some people felt confused. Some felt betrayed. Some had frozen Jacqueline in the role of eternal widow, and did not understand why she would marry again. But public judgment rarely understands private fear. For Jacqueline, Onassis offered protection, security, distance, a world beyond American political violence. He had wealth on a scale that could create walls around a family, private islands, yachts, security, a life across oceans. To the outside world, it looked glamorous. To Caroline, it may have felt far more complicated. She was entering another world of wealth and power, a world that was luxurious, but not simple, a world where her mother was trying to survive, a world where Caroline had to adapt again. By then, change had become one of the constants of her life. The White House, Georgetown, New York, Greece, the Kennedy world, the Onassis world, public memory, private adjustment. She belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. For a young girl, this kind of life can create a strange emotional split. On the outside, there is privilege, beautiful homes, elite schools, travel, security, famous relatives, powerful connections. But inside, there can be instability, loss, uncertainty, the fear that happiness may never last. Caroline was learning that wealth could change the scenery around grief, but it could not remove grief itself. As she grew older, Caroline did not choose the loudest path. She did not become a public performer of her family name. She did not chase celebrity. She did not rush into politics to reclaim her father's place. Instead, she turned toward education, toward books, toward history, toward law, toward quieter forms of meaning. She attended Radcliffe College and studied history. It was a fitting subject for someone whose own childhood had already become part of history. But studying history may also have given Caroline a way to understand what had happened to her. History turns chaos into sequence. It places pain inside context. It teaches that private lives are often shaped by forces larger than the individual. For Caroline, history was not abstract. It was family. It was memory. It was the burden she carried in her name. After graduating, she later attended Columbia Law School. Law offered another kind of structure: rights, institutions, language, responsibility. In a life marked by sudden violence and uncontrollable loss, the law may have represented order, a world where words mattered, where rules mattered, where public life could be shaped by principle instead of tragedy. Caroline's education revealed something important about her character. She was not trying to escape the Kennedy legacy by becoming frivolous. She was trying to meet it seriously, but she would meet it on her own terms. She did not become her father. She did not become her mother. She did not become her brother. She became quieter, more guarded, more intellectual, more private. And in that privacy, she began to form a life that belonged to her. In the 1980s, Caroline worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There she met Edwin Schlossberg, an artist, designer, and writer. He was not a politician. He did not belong to the same kind of public dynasty. His world was art, design, ideas, and creativity. For Caroline, this may have offered something different, a life connected to culture rather than political hunger, a relationship that did not require her to perform the Kennedy myth every day. They married in 1986 on Cape Cod. The wedding was beautiful, but like nearly everything in Caroline's life, it could not be completely private. The public wanted details. The media wanted images. The country still felt connected to her. Even love for Caroline could not fully escape observation. Yet the marriage marked a new chapter. She was building her own family, her own home, her own circle. She kept the Kennedy name. That choice mattered. It was an act of continuity. It was also an acknowledgement that the name was part of her identity. She could not abandon it, but she could decide how to carry it. Caroline and Edwin had 3 children: Rose, Tatiana, Jack. For Caroline, motherhood must have carried deep emotional meaning. She had lost the safety of childhood early. Now she had the chance to create safety for someone else. She had grown up watched. She wanted her children protected. She had been turned into a symbol. She wanted them to become people. This became one of the quiet missions of her life: to give her children room, to let them grow without being consumed by the Kennedy story. It was not easy. The name followed them too. But Caroline understood the danger better than anyone. She knew what public fascination could take. She knew how it could turn childhood into performance. She knew how strangers could feel entitled to family pain, and so she guarded her children. Not with dramatic speeches, but with boundaries, with silence, with distance, with the refusal to make every private moment public. For a time, Caroline seemed to have created a life that balanced legacy and privacy. She had a husband, children, work, books, public responsibilities, a connection to the Kennedy Library, a role in preserving her father's memory. She was not living outside history, but she was no longer completely trapped inside it. Then, in 1994, another anchor disappeared. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died after a battle with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. She was 64. To the world, Jackie was an icon, the elegant First Lady, the widow of a murdered president, the woman who restored the White House, the woman who turned grief into public grace, the woman whose clothes, voice, and posture became part of 20th century memory. But to Caroline, she was mother, protector, teacher, guide, the woman who had held her hand through history's most brutal entrance into childhood. Jackie had taught Caroline how to survive public attention, how to move through a room without giving everything away, how to protect the private self, how to honor the past without collapsing under it. Losing her meant losing the person who understood the full shape of Caroline's life. Not as myth, not as headline, but as lived experience. After Jackie's death, Caroline and John Jr. became the two remaining children of Camelot. They were adults now. But they were still bound by a childhood no one else could truly share. They had both lived in the White House. Both lost their father as children. Both watched their mother become an icon of grief. Both spent their lives under the gaze of a public that loved them, but also consumed them. John Jr. carried that attention differently. He was handsome, charismatic, and magnetic. To many Americans, he seemed like a living continuation of his father. The media called him America's Prince. People followed him, photographed him, speculated about him, projected dreams onto him. But to Caroline, he was not a prince, he was her brother, the one person who understood what it meant to be them, the one person who had stood beside her in the same childhood storm. In July 1999, that bond was broken. John F. Kennedy Jr. was flying a small plane from New Jersey toward Massachusetts. With him were his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette. They were traveling for a family wedding. The plane disappeared. At first there was uncertainty, then fear. Then the national waiting began. Search teams moved across the waters near Martha's Vineyard. News anchors repeated the limited details. The public watched with a terrible sense of recognition. Once again, the Kennedy name was attached to sudden disaster. Once again, Americans waited for news about a family they felt they knew. When the wreckage was found, the truth became unavoidable. John, Carolyn, and Lauren were dead. John was 38 years old. Caroline was 41. And she was now the only surviving child of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. This loss was different from the loss of her father. When her father died, Caroline was a child. She could not fully understand the world that had collapsed around her. But when John died, she understood everything. She understood the headlines, the investigation, the public fascination, the meaning of the date, the hunger for photographs, the endless commentary. She understood what she had lost, not just a brother, a witness, a companion in memory. The last person who knew what it had felt like to grow up as one of those two children. There is a loneliness that comes when a sibling dies. But Caroline's loneliness carried another layer. She had lost the only person who shared her exact origin story. No one else could remember their father in the same way. No one else could remember Jackie as the mother of those particular children. No one else could fully understand how strange it was to be loved by strangers because of a tragedy that had destroyed your family. After John's death, Caroline became even more protective. She insisted on privacy where she could. She resisted the transformation of every Kennedy loss into public ceremony. This was not emotional distance. It was emotional defense. When grief has been watched too often, privacy becomes sacred. When the world has claimed your tears before, silence becomes a way of keeping something for yourself. In the years after John's death, Caroline did not disappear, but she became even more selective about visibility. She continued to honor her family's legacy through the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. She supported the Profile in Courage Award. She wrote and edited books about constitutional rights, poetry, faith, patriotism, and civic values. Her work was often quiet, but it was deeply connected to memory. She was preserving the better meaning of the Kennedy name, not the glamour, not the gossip, not the endless fascination with tragedy, but the idea of public service, the idea of courage, the idea that power should be tied to responsibility. This was Caroline's way of fighting back against the curse narrative. She would not allow the family story to be only a list of deaths. She would make it also about citizenship, books, education, public duty, institutions, memory with purpose. But being the keeper of a legend is lonely work. A legend does not belong only to the family, it belongs to the public, to historians, to journalists, to politicians, to admirers, to critics, to people who use it for their own needs. Caroline had to protect her father's memory, while knowing others would always reinterpret it. She had to protect her mother's dignity, while knowing the world would always claim Jackie as an icon. She had to raise her children while the Kennedy name continued to carry fascination, expectation, and danger. And through all of it, she had to remain herself, not merely the daughter, not merely the survivor, not merely the last child of Camelot. In 2008, Caroline stepped more visibly into national politics when she endorsed Barack Obama. Her endorsement carried symbolic force. Many people saw it as the passing of a torch, a connection between the idealism of John F. Kennedy and the promise of a new political generation. Once again, the public placed meaning on Caroline. Once again, she became more than herself. She was not simply a private citizen with an opinion. She was a Kennedy giving her blessing to a political movement. For a brief time, there was speculation that she might enter the United States Senate. Some imagined her finally taking her place in elected office, a Kennedy daughter continuing the family's political line. But the moment did not become her path. Caroline withdrew from consideration. The reasons were personal and widely discussed, but the deeper truth may be simpler. The Kennedy spotlight was never just light, it was heat. Caroline knew better than almost anyone what that heat could do. In 2013, she chose a different form of public service. President Barack Obama appointed her United States ambassador to Japan. It was a role filled with symbolism. Her father had served in the Pacific during World War II. The United States and Japan had once been enemies. Now his daughter would represent America in Tokyo as a symbol of alliance, peace, and diplomacy. This time, Caroline was not a child inside history. She was an adult choosing to serve within it. As ambassador, she took on diplomatic responsibilities with seriousness. She represented the United States in a country where the Kennedy name still carried recognition and respect. She attended ceremonies, supported culture exchange, worked within one of America's most important alliances. For the first time in a long time, Caroline's public identity was not only about what she had survived, it was about what she could do. That mattered, because survival alone can become a cage. If the world only sees what you endured, it may fail to see what you built. Caroline had endured much, but she had also built a life of service. Later, she became United States Ambassador to Australia. Again, she carried the Kennedy name abroad. Again, her presence connected personal history with public duty. But by then, she was no longer simply stepping into a family tradition. She had become an experienced figure in her own right, measured, disciplined, careful. Her public style was never explosive, never theatrical, never hungry for applause. It was reserved, sometimes distant, often quiet, but there was strength in that quiet. Caroline had learned long ago that too much exposure could destroy what was most human. While she served and worked, her children grew into adults. Rose, Tatiana, and Jack each found their own paths. Rose entered creative fields. Tatiana became a journalist and author focused on climate and environmental issues. Jack became visible in political commentary and public life, carrying a resemblance that reminded many people of his uncle John Jr. For Caroline, watching them become themselves must have been deeply meaningful. She had tried to give them space, tried to protect them from becoming only Kennedy symbols, tried to let them live not as echoes but as individuals. In some ways, this may have been one of her greatest achievements, not a public office, not a diplomatic title, but motherhood under the pressure of a famous name. To raise children inside a dynasty and still allow them personhood is not simple. It requires boundaries. It requires discipline. It requires saying no to a world that always wants more access. But even the strongest boundaries cannot stop illness. In 2025, Tatiana Schlossberg shared publicly that she had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia after giving birth to her second child in 2024. Her writing about the illness was intimate and devastating. She described treatment, fear, motherhood, the strange cruelty of facing death while raising very young children. She was not writing as a symbol. She was writing as a daughter, a mother, a wife, a person trying to understand how life could become so fragile so quickly. For readers, it was heartbreaking. For Caroline, it was far beyond heartbreaking. It was her child, her daughter, the girl she had raised, the life she had tried to protect. The tragedy cut into the deepest of Caroline's life, that love could be taken, that safety was temporary, that no amount of care could fully protect the people closest to her. Caroline had already lost her father, her baby brother Patrick, her uncle Bobby, her mother, her brother John, and now she faced the illness of her daughter. The pattern was unbearable, but this was not mythology. This was not simply another chapter in the so-called Kennedy curse. This was a mother watching her daughter suffer. Tatiana died on December 30th, 2025. She was 35 years old. There are some losses language cannot make elegant. No documentary line can soften them. No music can explain them. No famous name can make them meaningful. A mother buried her child. That is the center. That is the wound. For Caroline Kennedy, whose entire life had been shaped by public mourning, this grief must have carried a terrible weight. Once again, the world knew. Once again, the Kennedy name turned private pain into public reflection. Once again, people spoke of tragedy, fate, loss, and the curse. But phrases like that can make suffering sound distant, almost poetic, almost unreal. Caroline's life reminds us that behind every famous family tragedy, there is someone who has to live through the ordinary hours afterward, the quiet rooms, the unanswered messages, the empty chair, the birthday that still comes, the photographs that suddenly hurt to look at. Public grief has ceremonies. Private grief has mournings. And Caroline has known too many of both. In recent years, Caroline also made headlines for publicly opposing her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. Her letter was unusually direct and deeply personal. It revealed something important about her position within the Kennedy family. She was not merely preserving a name. She was also deciding what that name should mean. Families with great legacies often face this problem. The name becomes larger than any one person. It can be used by different relatives for different purposes. It can inspire public service. It can also create conflict, ambition, and division. For Caroline, carrying the Kennedy legacy did not mean defending every Kennedy. It meant protecting a standard, a belief in responsibility, a belief in truth, a belief that public power must be treated seriously. That kind of guardianship is not glamorous. It can be lonely. It can create family tension. It can make the person holding the line seem severe. But Caroline Kennedy has never seemed interested in being easy to read. She has seemed interested in being careful. And perhaps carefulness is what a life like hers requires. The public often wants emotional access from famous people. It wants tears, confessions, vulnerability, a window into pain. Caroline has usually refused to give too much. That refusal is part of her story. It may frustrate the public, but it also protects the human being behind the public name. After a lifetime of being watched, her privacy is not emptiness. It is possession. It is the one thing history did not fully take. Caroline Kennedy's life is often described through tragedy, and tragedy is undeniably there. It is impossible to tell her story without it, but she should not be reduced to loss. That would be another injustice. She is also a woman of work, of intellect, of loyalty, of discipline, of public service. She has written books, supported civic education, represented her country overseas, raised children, protected institutions, honored memory. She has carried a famous name without turning herself into a spectacle. And in an age that rewards constant exposure, that restraint is almost radical. The tragedy of Caroline Kennedy is not a downfall in the ordinary sense. She did not lose everything through scandal. She did not destroy herself through greed. She did not chase fame until fame consumed her. Her tragedy is quieter, more complicated, more haunting. It is the tragedy of being left behind, the tragedy of survival, the tragedy of becoming the keeper of everyone else's memory. She is the child who survived the assassination of her father, the daughter who lost her mother, the sister who lost her brother, the mother who lost her daughter, the public figure who kept walking through history, even when history had been cruel to her. And through it all, she has rarely asked for sympathy. She has rarely explained herself. She has rarely allowed the world to enter the deepest rooms of her grief. That silence is not empty. It is full of everything she has carried. When people speak about Camelot, they often speak with romance. They remember youth, beauty, hope, music, style. the sense that America once had a royal family of its own. But Caroline Kennedy's life asks us to look at Camelot differently. Not from the crowd, not from the camera, not from the history book, but from inside the family. From inside, Camelot was not only glamorous, it was fragile, it was brief, it was haunted. It left behind children who had to live with its glow and its ashes. Caroline inherited the glow, but she also inherited the ashes. The world saw the famous name. It did not always see the cost of carrying it. The world saw the privilege. It did not always see the isolation. The world saw the legacy. It did not always see the pressure. The world saw survival. It did not always see what survival demanded. Caroline Kennedy's life proves that privilege does not cancel pain. Wealth does not prevent loneliness. Admiration does not heal grief. Power does not guarantee safety. And a beautiful public image can hide a lifetime of private endurance. Perhaps that is why her story remains so powerful. Because it is not only the story of one famous woman. It is the story of what happens when a person becomes a symbol too early. When childhood belongs partly to strangers. When family memories become public property. When grief is photographed. When legacy becomes both gift and burden. Caroline Kennedy has spent her life between two worlds. The world of public memory and the world of private love. Public memory remembers the president. Private love remembers the father. Public memory remembers Jackie. Private love remembers the mother. Public memory remembers John Jr. as a prince. Private love remembers the brother. Public memory sees Tatiana as another Kennedy tragedy. Private love remembers the daughter. That difference matters. Because history turns people into figures. Love remembers them as human beings. Caroline has had to carry both, the figure and the person, the myth and the wound, the archive and the ache. In the end, Caroline Kennedy may be one of the most quietly tragic figures in modern American public life, not because she failed, but because she endured. She endured what no amount of privilege could soften. She endured loss under the eyes of a nation. She endured the expectations of a family name too large for any one person. She endured the transformation of private grief into public legend. And still, she continued. Carefully, privately, purposefully. That is not the kind of strength that demands attention. It is the kind that survives without asking permission. Caroline Kennedy was given a name that sounded like destiny. But destiny is of a word people use after the fact. When they want chaos to look planned. When they want pain to have shape. When they want tragedy to seem meaningful. Caroline's life was not destiny. It was life. Brilliant in some places. Devastating in others. Filled with love, marked by absence, surrounded by admiration, shadowed by loneliness. She was born into American royalty, but American royalty is not real protection. It is an illusion made of cameras, headlines, wealth, and longing. It cannot stop a bullet. It cannot stop a plane from falling. It cannot stop illness. It cannot stop a mother from burying a child. What it can do is make the pain visible, make it symbolic, make it belong to everyone and no one at the same time. Caroline Kennedy has lived with that strange bargain for nearly her entire life. The public gave her admiration, but also expectation. It gave her sympathy, but also intrusion. It gave her a place in history, but history took away her privacy. And still she found ways to build meaning. Through books, through family, through diplomacy, through service, through silence, through the careful preservation of memory. The little girl in the White House became the woman who carried Camelot's last light. But that light was never weightless. It followed her, it warmed her, it burned her, it made her visible, it made her lonely, and somehow she kept walking, not untouched, not unbroken, not free from sorrow, but still standing. In that, perhaps, lies the deepest truth of Caroline Kennedy's life. She did not escape the shadow of her name, but she learned how to move through it, with restraint, with dignity, with grief, with service. With the quiet strength of someone who has lost too much to believe in easy myths. Caroline Kennedy's story is not the story of a woman who had everything. It is the story of a woman who was given everything the world could see and lost so much the world could never truly measure. She inherited fame. She inherited history. She inherited admiration. She inherited responsibility. And she inherited grief. But she also built something of her own. A life of purpose. A life of memory. A life of guarded love, a life that refused to become only tragedy. And maybe that is the final lesson of Caroline Kennedy. That survival is not always loud. Sometimes survival is quiet. Sometimes it is private. Sometimes it looks like continuing to serve, continuing to protect, continuing to remember, continuing to stand, even when the past is heavy enough to break almost anyone. The world may always see her as the last daughter of Camelot, but she is more than that. She is the woman who carried the name, the woman who protected the memory, the woman who endured the losses, the woman who understood, more than most, that fame can surround you without saving you, and that even inside the most legendary families, the deepest pain is still painfully human.